Thank you. It's great to be speaking to you all this afternoon. And if we could show the slide. I'll be speaking to you about the imperative of racial justice, a call to action for churches in the UK. Now, as has been said, racial justice is a topic that is of paramount importance, and it's an agenda item currently under Strategic Aim 7 for churches together in England. Now, it can be said that there is a storm that's brewing in our nation. The streets of the UK have witnessed unrest, the air thick with the cries for equality, and the unsettling rise of extremism. From the riots that have shaken our cities to the alarming surge of Christian and right-wing nationalism, recent events serve as a stark reminder that the fight for racial justice and racial equality is far from over. But before I go further into this presentation, it's important to highlight that this struggle is not new. It echoes throughout decades, embodied in the unwavering determination of individuals like Doreen Lawrence, who still seeks justice for her son Stephen, a victim of a racially aggravated murder that shook our nation's conscience. So we will look at the work of the Racial Justice Working Group since its inception in 2021, highlight some of our key achievements, partnership, and the need for continued commitment. And I'm a Pentecostal, so please say amen. 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 Okay. So the context of our work, what is the context that the Racial Justice Working Group is currently operating in? Well, there's a rising cultural and ideological tensions. The current climate in the UK reflects, as I said, a disturbing resurgence of nationalism, marked by racial tensions, Brexit, negative narratives, and concerns around migration. Now, as I was thinking about this, nationalism really presents a profound paradox in our society. Why? Because on the one hand, it has the potential to foster a real sense of belonging, encourage civic engagement, and promote unity within the nation. However, in its extreme forms, it poses significant dangers, particularly in the age of digital communication. Social media and its algorithms amplify divisive narratives, influencing public perception in harmful ways. This digital echo chamber has the speed and the power to compound the negative aspects of nationalism, threatening the very foundations of social cohesion. And as a result, we can risk normalizing intolerance and promoting an us versus them mentality. And this polarization can directly undermine our core Christian values of justice, equality, and love for all. As I said, it's crucial to recognize that nationalism in and of itself is not inherently negative. When inclusive, I believe it can promote a shared sense of purpose, inspire positive change, and rebuild resilient communities. And I'm sure everyone would agree, after COVID-19, we need that. However, the challenge we face today and the context that the Racial Justice Working Group is working in is ensuring that national pride is not hijacked by far-right movements, which seek to turn it into a tool for exclusion and supremacy. And this can often lead to a dangerous conflation of national identity with exclusionary ideologies that marginalize communities of colour, immigrants, and other minority groups. And these extreme forms of nationalism can foster xenophobia, division, and the erosion of democratic principles, creating environments where fear and hatred are weaponized against those who are different. And if we look through history, this can echo a dangerous pattern of scapegoating, populism, and division, particularly at times of cultural and economic upheaval. When resources are tight, we see what can happen to the cultural tide. Now, political theorist Benedict Anderson's idea of nations as imagined communities reminds us that national identity is actually a social construct, one that we have the power as churches to shape towards inclusion, dignity, solidarity, rather than division. Another theologian that I love is Dr. Soong Chan, and he observes, distorted forms of nationalism assumes that God's blessings are reserved for a select few, perpetrating systematic racism and betraying the gospel's universal message of grace and redemption for all people. So in the face of these distortions, I believe that the church cannot afford to remain silent. Dr. Jameer Tisby, he challenges us that the church must rise as a prophetic voice for justice, equality, and healing, presenting a vision of community grounded in compassion and the gospel's radical call for relationship and love, which includes every neighbour, regardless of race or background. So this is the context that our Racial Justice Working Group is currently working in, and we must stand as counterweights to this dangerous narrative of exclusion and division. The next slide, please. So what's a response? In 2021, the Racial Justice Working Group was established by yourselves as the enabling group for churches together in England. And this was initially because of the public execution of George Floyd, which we all unfortunately witnessed on our screens. The murder of George Floyd really exposed the deep-seated, systematic racial disparities across the world, including in England, especially for people of African descent. And this global reckoning has challenged churches to confront racism head-on and also to look within their own structures. Leadership appointments, where is money being assigned? It's made us do an internal audit. And our group is a representation of CT's 52 member churches, CT trustees. We have a representative from CTBI, our wonderful Richard Reddy here, who's a director of racial justice there, and specialists in racial justice. And our vision is clear, is to serve as beacons of racial justice and to present best practices within our church structures, fostering deep ecumenical relationships that break down barriers and promote equity. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I said, our work in our Racial Justice Working Group is not just an organisational task, it's a moral and spiritual imperative. You know, the mission of God is to relieve suffering. Would we agree with that? And racism, whether experienced as the perpetrator or victim, causes immense harm and mars the image of God in the other. And I think it's also important to note and recognise that the challenge of racism is not just for those who are oppressed, but it is also liberating the perpetrators from the harmful, distorted ideologies that fuel hatred and discrimination. So it's not just about those who are experiencing racism. This is about freeing those who perpetrate, because the image of God is being marred in beauty and is often rooted in false notions of supremacy. Now, churches have a crucial opportunity, as I said, to work together to bring this justice and healing to our society. And the Racial Justice Working Group has worked out its mission through two streams, and that's theology and advocacy. And these pillars allow us to address this issue from a spiritual and practical dimension. Next slide, please. So what's been some of our impact over the last 3.5 years since you constituted this group? Next slide, please. So we have launched a National Candle of Justice initiative in partnership with Premier Christian Radio, which ignited a nationwide prayer movement, and it united our presidents, member churches, schools, chaplaincies, hospitals and youth groups in a collective moment of prayer concerning racial justice. So as you can see, we have our president, Reverend Helen Cameron. We had participation from the World Council of Churches. We also had Bishop Desmond Jadu, who is the chair of the Dejan Reed campaign. Now, if you don't know about Dejan Reed, unfortunately, he was a 14-year-old boy that was killed in a racially aggravated murder, and all of his murderers were acquitted because the jury was not racially diverse. Rest in peace. We also have Bishop Sarah, the Bishop of York, and Pastor Agu, who have spoken into these issues. The next slide, please. That is the coolest ringtone ever. Wow, just saying. Okay. We've also looked at theological education and webinars. So we've partnered with Christian Aid, Sankofa Collective, Faith Forum, Tear Fund, Professor Robert Beckford from the Queen's Ecumenical Institution to really look at how theology, faith and the church can work together, and to equip congregations with issues. When we was listening, particularly to congregations in rural communities, they said, how do we do this? We need training, so we provided some of that. We also delivered anti-racism training at Ripon College, so they invited us to speak to their clergy to look at what does your leadership in the Church of England look like going forward, and how do you ensure that it's racially diverse. We've also spoken to the Ecumenical Theological Group, which brings together different deans from the ecumenical churches to look at including global majority theology into their curriculum. And now you might be thinking, what's the point of that? Well, it's to decolonize theological pedagogy. And why do we want to do that? Because we need to decolonize Western education and challenge the prevailing notion that Western theology is normative and the standard bearer of intellectual rigor or real theology, or that global majority or missional theology is secondary or peripheral. This dichotomy, rooted in colonial structures, not only distorts theological education, but it perpetrates a harmful hierarchy of knowledge. Next slide, please. We've also contributed to the United Nations recommendation regarding the treatment of African and diaspora communities, and this has helped to amplify our voice on an international platform. So we want to thank Dr. Elizabeth for that great opportunity to speak into that agenda, and also to commend the Quakers. They've done a lot of work in speaking into this agenda. Next slide, please. Right, so we've also spoken into the Windrush scandal. We, along with the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum, organised the official service, which actually had 850 people in attendance, including members of the royal family. And whilst we wanted to celebrate, we were also in Birmingham helping, you'll see Bishop Mike Rowe there, helping with the Birmingham Windrush service. We've also, next slide, spoke about some of the injustices. So whilst it's great to honour narrative, look at the contribution of the Windrush generation to the UK, we've also spoken about the horrific scandal from the Home Office about the Windrush generation. And we've worked with the chair of the National Windrush Organisation to look at policy and to speak at their vigil. Next slide, please. We've also looked into the issue of chaplaincy. So as we were speaking to some of our member churches, what was coming up, particularly from Black majority Pentecostal and Charismatic member churches, is that they don't feel they're having as much opportunity in the chaplaincy space, because it's often gridlocked by the historical denominations. Now Trevor, Reverend Trevor, has been amazing, and Bishop Paul, and from the Free Churches group, in helping to expand that conversation, and we're working strategically with those two partners to look at how we can open space for other church leaders in chaplaincy. Next slide, please. We've also spoken into the issue of racial justice and climate justice, and this included going to South Africa on a field trip with Christian Aid to look at how Western consumption is actually building a lot of the issues with climate injustice in global majority countries, and was able to write a report about that, which I can share more widely on recommendations for what we can do in the UK. Next slide, please. In our last racial justice working group, it came to our attention that there's also some disparities in racial equality within our ecumenical structures, particularly with our worship leaders and music artists. Some came back to us to say that their music and their songs are not being played across churches, so this is having an economic impact because they're not getting royalties from their music. Whereas a lot of black majority churches will use the music of white artists. So you can see there's some disparity going on there. So they came to us as churches together in England to see, do you have a voice in that? Can you help us to ensure there's equality with music across the ecumenical landscape? Next slide, please. So as I said, our work also expands into advocacy, and we'd like to thank our partners, the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum at CTBI, who we worked very closely with. And we wrote a statement with them and through them about Chris Carber, who was tragically murdered by the Met Police. And we also denounced the racial attacks on the black footballers in the 2020 Euro finals. We also held a webinar, Justice for Child Q, who was unfortunately strip searched in a school, with our Pentecostal president and the Church of God of Prophecy to host this webinar for churches to get information. We've also worked with the parliamentary group for youth violence and spoken to that agenda item. Next and final slide. We can't do this work alone. Ecumenism isn't about silos. We work with great partners, as I've said, the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum. We work alongside the Evangelical Alliance, speaking into their research around race and evangelicals. We've also worked with the Church of England Commissioners Oversight Group, and in particular Georgia Boom, who's the Director of Planning Engagement, to give ecumenical insights into the 100 million fund. And we've been able to speak into that. And we thank also Sharon, who's the representative there, Dr. Sharon, thank you for that opportunity. And we're also going to be working with the Society for Ecumenical Studies to host our first Racial Justice Conference in 2025, to which you are all invited, and more information will come out about